So good evening and a warm welcome to Aspiring Barristers Wellbeing at the Bar event. My name is Clara Jennings and I'm your host for this evening. I'm a third year law student and aspiring barrister and an ambassador for Aspiring Barristers. For those of you who may not know, Aspiring Barristers aim to support all aspiring barristers on their journey to the bar, focusing specifically on accessibility and diversity, which in turn supports inclusion. This ensures that the profession at the bar will remain a serious option for all talented aspiring barristers. We cover a wide range of topics at our online events, and we hope those aspiring for a career at the bar will find them really, really helpful. This evening's event is focusing on wellbeing at the bar, which brings me to introduce our panellists. So joining me this evening are Victoria Wilson, who's a family barrister from Goldsmith Chambers. Victoria was chair of the 2020 Wellbeing at the Bar Working Group, and she's the chair of the FLBA Wellbeing Subcommittee. So welcome to you, Victoria. And we have Valerie Charbit, who is a criminal barrister at Red Lion Chambers and Wellbeing Director for the Criminal Bar Association and representative on the Bar Council's Working Party Group on Wellbeing. So a warm welcome to you.
Good evening.
And last but by no means least, and kicking off this evening, is Cunningham, who is a psychologist, mental health first aid trainer and co-founder of the Workplace Wellbeing Academy. So welcome to you as well.
Thank you. Good evening.
So Bill, can you tell us a little bit more about your career and background and your work with the Workplace Wellbeing Academy?
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name's Bill Cunningham, in terms of my career, it's been quite many and varied. In common with quite a large number of people who work in the field of mental health, my original career was actually in theatre. I spent about 15 years working backstage in theatres, rising to become a stage manager. And believe you me, if you're talking about areas around mental health and well-being, you see all of that stuff read in tooth and claw when you work in a theatre, because it's such a pressured environment. There are conflicting personalities and sometimes teddies go out the pram along the way. And along hand in hand with that, I served for most of that period as a union rep as well. And I found during that period that a lot of the people who were coming to me to talk about different issues, they weren't coming necessarily to talk to me about the stuff that was going on at home. At work, rather, it might be the stuff that was influencing coming from home. So I became quite a good and patient listener during that period. And that led me, as I approached my 40s, to decide to take a career break, and a change indeed. And I chose another path, which was something I'd always found fascinating, which is around the idea of hypnosis. And so I trained to become a hypnotherapist and left my job in theatre as my 40th birthday present to myself, setting up in private practice. And as that progressed, what I found more and more was that a lot of the people that were knocking on my door were coming to me with what you could identify as common mental health issues, but they were resistant to going to see a doctor because they were fearful of what a diagnosis might mean for them in terms of, oh, what ifs? What if this affects my employment? What if this affects the way I feel about myself? What if it affects the way people think of me? And as a result of that, I realized I needed a little bit more background around mental health. And so I discovered a thing which had started in Scotland at that time, a thing called mental health first aid. I got involved with it. To cut a long story short, it took over my life. I was training people in mental health first aid all over the country. And I rose to become a mental health first aid national trainer. And I was training people to deliver the programme. Along the way, I finished my studies around psychology. And for 2 years in 2017, 2019, I went over to Ireland and lived there for a while and helped set up a similar programme in Ireland with the help of the St John of God Hospital over there, which is a big teaching hospital, and the Health Services Executive and other corporate sponsors. And indeed, I still spend quite a lot of my time in virtual Ireland to this day. In fact, I'll be in virtual Dublin tomorrow morning. The Workplace Wellbeing Academy is something which has sprung out of the pandemic crisis. Me and a couple of like-minded colleagues who actually have more of a background around coaching and health and safety, actually. And what we're doing here is we're pushing the idea of more proactive approaches to mental health and well-being in the workplace. Not just dealing with things when they happen, but trying to put in procedures and put in methods which mean that supportive environments can be set up within workplaces. And what you try to do is you change the whole workplace culture so that people know that they can talk about this stuff and they'll be listened to and perhaps signposted to the right kind of help by the organisation should those needs arise. I hope that makes sense.
It does, definitely. Thank you for that. And a lot of issues surrounding well-being at work emerge due to factors like heavy workload or burnout. And how do you think employers can adapt their policies to be mindful of these issues and promote a more positive workplace environment?
It's an interesting one in terms of the fact that a lot of companies, not just within the field of law, obviously the corporate kind of clients that I've worked with more recently, have got the mindset now that this is an issue. You know, if you think about the idea that 1 in 4 people experiencing a mental health difficulty in any given year, yeah, it's going to affect a large proportion of the workforce. So what they're trying to do is address this. But to be frank, a lot of the approaches that have been adopted so far are about this idea of reacting to a situation. And I'd say I've spent a long time, 15 years or so, 16 now, working around mental health first aid, which to be honest is more of a reactive approach. A person is given the role of being a mental health first aider. They're given a little bit more training in how to spot the signs and symptoms that a person might be struggling, and they're given guidance on how to be most helpful to that person at that point, signposting them on to help. More proactive approaches have been found to be more effective, both in a human sense and a business sense, in that they produce the most return for the money spent in the kinds of training programs, etc., that are along there. And actually, all of this stuff has been written down for companies for at least 20 years. The Health and Safety Executive, back in about the turn of the century, along with the Institute for the International Stress Managers Association and latterly the CIPD, are using a thing which they call the 6 management standards of the HSE. And these are those areas around work which can either be very positive for a person in the working environment, or if they're going wrong, that can lead to bigger problems. And they talk about things like the demands that are put upon a person, the amount of control that that person might have over their workflow, for instance, the amount of support that is available to people and whether they feel that they can actually access that support. Relationships in terms of team building and indeed bullying in the workplace. Are there pressures around that? Yeah. And also my role. Do I understand what my role actually involves? Do I understand the parameters of my role? Am I suffering from a lot of stress because I'm worried I'm going to be found out that I'm not performing my role? All the more easy if I don't know what it is, yeah? And then finally, the way in which change is communicated and managed in the workplace. And if you can set that up, if you can use that as your monitoring tool, you can set up systems which work very well on individual levels. Most of it's about communication. Most of it's about realizing that one size does not fit every person within your organization. People have different vulnerabilities, yeah? And it's all really about building up what is now being termed psychological health and safety. I think I mentioned it a few minutes ago. In fact, I think it was yesterday, ISO 45003 was published, and that's the international standard around managing workplace well-being. It's something to aspire to. And guess what? It's not rocket science, a lot of this. It's taking into account that, you know, I don't know who the bright spark was who decided that mental health and physical health was divided at the neck, and that's your mental health and that's your physical health. It's taking into account the fact that your mental health affects your physical health, and your physical health can affect your mental health. And there are things which can be done in the workplace to promote well-being. And let's face it, we spend an awful lot of time in the workplace, so that would be a very healthy place to be addressing these issues.
That's fantastic, thank you. And I know you have a background in cognitive behavioural therapy. So would you have any advice for stress management for students around exams, from transferring what you've just said maybe into educational institution and helping students rather than employees?
Okay, it's probably best to give, because not everybody knows what this thing is. I know it gets bandied around a lot, this CBT thing, and it sounds quite modern and you know, finger on the pulse and all the rest of it. And then people find out it came out in the 60s, so there's a tree hugging involved in it and the like. Is actually, it goes back to the Stoic philosophy of ancient Rome, and a lot of it is about this idea of there are things which are within my control and there are things which are outside of my control. Why should I exercise myself over the things that I cannot control? Yeah, I will look at the things which I can control. And at base, it's what's written on the tin, cognitive behavioral therapy. It makes the link between what you think can affect the way you feel, and that can affect the way that you behave. But guess what? You don't have to believe what you think. And we do fall foul of what sometimes get called common thinking distortions, yeah? And those can be things around catastrophizing around events, or beating ourselves up about we need to be perfect, etc. And what CBT would do on a fundamental level would be giving you tools to be able to challenge those thoughts which pop into your head. And they're often what they call automatic thoughts, yeah? And that can be very habit-based. What you can do with CBT, therefore, is, and it's very flexible, it can be one-to-one, it could be group work, it could be through books, it could be through journals, etc., is you can give yourself some alternatives in terms of the way in which you're thinking about the world, weigh up the evidence around that, and see which ones do I need to run with that, yeah? So what I'll do, because obviously time is limited here, if it's all right, I will try before the end to pop a little handout that I've got into the chat for people to take away. And this does talk about these common thinking distortions, the kinds of things that we trick ourselves with. And once you know about that, and once you can spot these negative automatic thoughts perhaps popping into your head, sometimes it's really liberating to be able to challenge them, weigh up what the evidence is, and say, as I say, do I need to run with that?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for that. So we're going to hear more from you a little later on in the evening, but I'm going to cross over now to Victoria Wilson. So Victoria, can you tell us a little bit about your journey to the bar and why you chose to become a member of the Wellbeing at the Bar working group?
Yeah, of course. Good evening, everyone. With the journey to the bar, when I was at school and I was about 14, 15 years old, I did work experience with a criminal barrister, and I thought it was really exciting. I thought, oh, wow, they wear wigs and gowns. And for me, that's what planted the seed of it. Then moving on, I went to university. I didn't read law. To be perfectly honest, I thought it would be really dull, so I did something else instead. And after university, I had that feeling of what do I do next? And I had two possible careers in mind. One was being a music journalist and the other was going to the bar. And so I decided to have a crack at the bar. And as Val will tell you as well, back in those days, we didn't have chambers websites. We didn't have any of that sort of thing. So you found out about barristers' chambers from this booklet, which used to have these codes in saying what that chambers did. And that was about it. So it was a very trial and error process. I didn't come from a family where there were any lawyers or anybody I could really ask about it. But at some point, I was lucky enough to spend some time with a High Court judge called Mrs. Justice Bracewell, who was a really amazing lady. and she was a family law judge. And basically that got me hooked, because it's all about human interest, human problems and so on. So that's how I became a family barrister. Now, on the question of how did I become a member of the Wellbeing at the Bar working group, this is something that Valerie and I have been involved in from the outset. Basically, back in 2015 or thereabouts, there was this huge survey of the whole of the bar, and it was the first time we'd ever had anything like it. And it was purely about your level of well-being as a barrister. How do you feel about this job? And this survey came back with some really troubling results. It basically said that there were really unhealthy high levels of perfectionism and anxiety in the job, and everyone was overthinking. And off the back of that and all of those concerns, the decision was made by the Bar Council to set up a Wellbeing at the Bar working group. And the members of that working group are from all different areas of the bar. And as a family practitioner, I'm a member of the Family Law Bar Association. So I came in on, I was invited to come onto the working group to represent the FLBA, and I did, and I've been on it ever since. And I was its chair last year, which was a real privilege. And it's done a huge amount to transform the way that people look at well-being at the bar. So in brief, that's how I got there. Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, you mentioned like perfectionism, overthinking and anxiety, which is something that a student would be going through before they even get to the bar, I suppose.
Definitely.
So what support mechanisms do the Wellbeing at the Bar working group have in place to support students and transferring over to practitioners with their well-being?
I'm going to highlight three things. Now, with students, there is a difference between, if you're studying your BPTC, your organisation will hopefully have some resources which you can avail yourself of there. But what you can access as a student is, we've set up a Wellbeing at the Bar website. That's wellbeingatthebar.org, which you will, if you Google it, it's got an amazing amount of resources for students. There's a tab that says help for students and pupils, and it's got, and then it then signposts you to areas such as work overload, anxiety, and all the very common themes. So I'd suggest as a student that you go and have a look at that. The second thing I'll highlight is that in general across the bar, there's a free and confidential assistance program, which is basically a counselling service. And the good news for students is that if you belong to one of the inns, they've all signed up to this pre-pupillage wellbeing assistance program as well, so you can access support. So if you've completed the bar course within the last 5 years and are seeking pupillage, you can actually, by virtue of that, through your inn, get free counselling if you need it, and access to a 24/7 confidential telephone line, which is obviously a really useful resource for students. The third aspect that I'll highlight is that the bar now provides mental health training to support people who are unwell, and obviously that in due course filters down to those coming up to the bar, because the bar is now at long last becoming a place where people can understand those sorts of issues and how to navigate them.
Thank you for that, Victoria. And what type of wellbeing issues do you see from students studying the BPC, and how do these issues differ from those experienced by practicing barristers, if at all?
I think as a student, you've got this double whammy of you've got your exams, or you've recently been through exams, and on top of that, trying to struggle through that, you're trying to go through the really exhausting process of applying for pupillage as well. And so from a wellbeing perspective, it's there's lots of issues caught up with that. So there's anxiety, there's work pressures, there's trying to keep those boundaries in place between work and home when you've got so much to do and you don't know when you're going to do it. The contrast, I think, with practicing barristers is that when you're a practicing barrister, the focus shifts to your caseload. And then obviously in real life, you're you've got your one advocacy opportunity on that day for a particular client. So your focus then is very much on the day-to-day and getting through a particular case and making sure you do your best for that client. But having said there is this contrast, I think the underlying themes are the same, because as a practicing barrister, you do get issues like anxiety and being overwhelmed by work and stress. It's just that the overarching goal on the surface, so to speak, is different.
Thank you, Victoria. Some sound advice there for our students. So we're going to come back to you later on.
Okay.
I'm going to bring us over now to Valerie Charbit. Valerie, how are you this evening? You okay?
Yeah, fine, thank you.
Good. So can you tell us about your journey to the bar and your role as Wellbeing Director for the Criminal Bar Association?
So I did study law at university. I came to it really after a conversation with my mum, asking her whether I should go into law or social work. And then when studying law at university, I looked at the difference between being supported financially as a solicitor or taking the perhaps more precarious route of being a barrister. And I did a couple of mini pupillages and absolutely loved the mini pupillage that I did in crime. Thought that that was far more interesting than the legal papers that I'd been reading in a solicitor's office. So that was really the route I decided to follow. And I always had a long-standing interest in, I suppose, social work and charitable organisations. And I continued to pursue charitable work whilst studying, and still to this day. But I came to do a criminal pupillage, not in my current chambers, but at 2 Bedford Row, and had a very happy 20 odd years there. And then several years ago decided to move to Red Lion Chambers. And yeah, I've pretty much diversified into quite a few other areas. So I practiced in health and safety and regulatory law. So I do a lot of professional disciplinary work, and I sit as a part-time mental health tribunal judge. So quite a varied practice, which I love. I would say that my journey to the bar, that sort of journey, has led me to have a real passion for well-being. And when the Working Party group was set up, it seemed a very natural thing to do to try and become part of that. I'd always wanted to support the bar from a well-being point of view, and had tried to pursue various initiatives in chambers to pursue better well-being. And so I ended up organising well-being events as on the southeastern circuit. So barristers have different circuits, and I was doing it as the recorder of the circuit, and then as the past recorder of the circuit, and then eventually was asked if I wanted to take over the wellbeing role for the Criminal Bar Association. So like Victoria, I've been involved in this for many years, and about to hand over actually, I think sometime very soon. But I think the Criminal Bar Association has sought to support barristers' well-being by running various events. I think where there's been a global pandemic, it's been a real challenge to try and consider how we can support their well-being. But we started before the pandemic with a series of events which were jointly held with the judiciary. So we got judges to come and speak and give their tips on well-being, which was a really good way to open up the conversation between the bar and judges about talking about these important issues and swapping war stories and tips on how to deal with the stresses and strains of the job. And we also had various practitioners come in. So we had somebody speak about vicarious trauma, and we pursued that throughout the pandemic remotely. So more recently, we've had mindfulness training, we've had various psychologists speaking, we've had a parenting expert, and very recently we had 4 barristers that had pursued employed work as part of their careers. So what we try and do is pick on areas that we think might support barristers and support them by way of events. But as Victoria mentioned, a big part of what was set up was also the assistance programme, so that all barristers and students could receive free counselling. And the statistics on that, which we were receiving, I don't think we've had them very recently, but they were pretty good. There was a steady increase in people taking up that service. It was slow, but I would say that that's a service that's there, and we feel quite passionate about it continuing to exist for the bar. So that's my story to the bar. I should say, just to connect with Bill, that after I was a practicing barrister, I did decide that I had never pursued my passion for theatre. So I took an MA in text and performance studies between King's College and RADA, and finally got to write. And yeah, I didn't like the performing so much, but I got to write. And I really enjoyed that. And I think theatre and the bar are quite similar in many ways. And yeah, it was a good addition to my CV. I think it gave me the creative aspect that I'd missed really by studying law. So that's really how I came to be working as Wellbeing Director for the CBA.
Thank you, Valerie. Maybe there's something in the water there. It could be a mixture of theatre and training how to be a barrister in the future, helping out with wellbeing maybe as well. You never know. I think the two go hand in hand, especially when you're in a courtroom and having to speak on behalf of your clients, I suppose. So the Criminal Bar Association stated back in 2018 that criminal barristers were experiencing a mental health crisis, particularly due to being overwhelmed by an increased workload. How has this position changed over the years, and what has been the impact of COVID on practicing criminal barristers and wellbeing?
Well, we're about to have the Bar Council do a wellbeing survey again, so it'll be interesting to see how that has changed. We've done one survey along the way when we were faced with flexible operating hours, which was an idea that the government were hoping to put in place. But I would say that before the COVID crisis, criminal barristers were struggling against more work for what were very static fees in publicly funded work. And that feeling of being overworked and overwhelmed was what really caused us to want to put in place support mechanisms to give people the ability to support one another through chambers, structures, through the inns, through the wellbeing at the bar, as best we could. Has it changed during COVID? Well, what I can say is that a lot of my colleagues that practiced only in crime had a complete downturn in work because jury trials were very much suspended for a period. Then they slowly were back, but the workload was much reduced because of the social distancing measures that were put in place. And I know now that courts are encouraged to have use as many sitting days and using other buildings. And so I think things aren't quite back to normal because we're still finding that there is a huge backlog of cases, and cases that were due to come on are still not coming on. So I think the position for criminal barristers is difficult. It is publicly funded work, and I wouldn't want it to put anyone off being a criminal barrister, because it's a great job. But I think you are very much needing nowadays to support it by perhaps doing some non-publicly funded work as well. Yeah, we're just hoping for better times and for things to get slowly back to normal, and jury trials to continue. And I'm pleased to say that we've at the criminal bar, the leadership maintained the position that we would continue to sit with live juries and not end up with remote juries or a smaller jury pool. And I think that's a good thing myself. And we've continued to run events for barristers, and those events will continue throughout remotely until we can all get back together, which we're hoping will be sometime.
Thank you, Valerie. So we're going to move over to our first topic of the evening, which is imposter syndrome. And I, for one, have experienced this on a number of occasions, and know I will probably experience it more as I progress in my career. So I'm going to hand over to Bill for this one. What is the correlation between imposter syndrome and mental health?
Okay, let me qualify this by just making it clear that there's more to mental health, that phrase mental health, than mental health problems, yes? Mental health sits on a continuum, and there's positive mental health and not so positive mental health. And one of the traps that people often fall into is if they hear that phrase mental health, they only think about the issues, yeah? But if we're looking at a thing like imposter syndrome, I would say that whilst it's not what you might term in terms of the diagnostic stuff, a disorder of itself, it certainly fits into the spectrum around anxiety. And it's all about this idea of they're going to find me out. And guess what? We've all got that. At base, we are not supposed to be sitting on Zoom this evening. At base, we were not supposed to be doing any of this stuff. We're probably supposed to be sitting around a fire somewhere, having just hunter-gathered all day. You know, the roles that we adopt are roles that we adopt. And sometimes what happens is if we become anxious about our abilities, if we're maybe getting trapped by some of that negative self-talk I mentioned earlier, the kinds of automatic negative thoughts which might pop into our heads, what we can get is into a kind of vicious circle of thought, and that can lead to kind of panic responses, etc. There's a really useful model around this whole idea of anxiety and also around mental health difficulties, and it links itself to stress. And that would be one of the fundamental factors that might be going on for somebody who might be experiencing imposter syndrome. Yeah. The idea comes from just up the road from where I am here now. It was a model put together at the turn of the century at Durham University, and it talks about stress, and it talks about our capacity for stress. And what it imagines is that we all have this individual capacity for stress, which is envisaged in the idea that we're all carrying a bucket around. And the stress falls into that bucket, the stress of our lives, the unavoidable stress of our lives, yeah? But it's quite an interesting book. It's more like a brew bin. It's got a tap on the side and it's wide open. And if all's going well for us, what happens is the stress can only build up to a certain level before it drains off naturally. But if things aren't going well for us, yeah, if we're not looking after ourselves properly or other factors are at play, what can happen is that tap can fur up and the stress can build up in the bucket. Or there might be something so traumatic that happens in our lives all of a sudden that there's a whole torrent of stress pours into our bucket all at once. The tap gets overwhelmed, and if it overspills, that's when we're developing issues. That's when we're starting to have problems. But I think the main thing about imposter syndrome is to acknowledge that we can all be subject to it. It's part of the human condition. There's a wonderful cartoon out there I put on my website a few years ago, which is a load of people walking down the street and they've all got thought bubbles going up and it all comes into one. Everybody else knows what they're doing, but I don't. They're going to find me out, kind of thing, yeah? acknowledging that gives you a little bit of a chance to perhaps go, everybody's been here sometimes. Maybe there's stuff I can do about this.
Thank you, Bill. And how do you think imposter syndrome can be addressed through personal development techniques, maybe?
Well, I was a bit uncertain about this idea of personal development techniques, but if we're going to do this in a sort of, you know, we could probably talk about this at length and do a whole evening on things like that. But one thing I can tell you from my experience of training trainers is I have often had people in front of me who are about to stand on their hind legs, perhaps for the first time in their lives, and present to a bunch of people, and they're going through exactly this kind of difficulty in terms of confidence, etc. And there's one thing that I put into place around this, which is based on evidence and based on experience, and that's this idea of talking about trying to take on your training persona in this situation. It doesn't necessarily have to be you standing up there. You can adopt this. We talked about roles earlier. When we do some of the mental health awareness training and we're talking to people who are keen to help a fellow human being who might be in distress, yeah, often what we're talking about is you at least need to, we say, oh, stay calm in these situations. And the wise ones amongst them often say, well, how am I going to stay calm in this situation? I'm not going to feel calm in this situation. And it stems back to this idea of faking it until you can make it to a large extent. And if we look back to the 19th century, the father of American psychology in particular, there was a kind of European American split at that point, was a guy called William James, who was the brother of the novelist Henry James. And one of the things that he used to use a more philosophical approach around this, but then he followed his ideas up. And he said at one point, if you want equality, act as if you already have it. And it's been broken down now into what they call the as-if principle. This idea that if you want to improve your confidence, behave as a confident person, yeah? There's a huge amount of evidence that's been pushed through over the last 20, 25, 30 years, which indicates that your behavior can affect the way you feel, yeah? So that CBT wheel can actually work in an opposite direction. And to give you a simple example, when I was working in Ireland in particular, I was going all over the country training in different locations, sometimes quite isolated, a lot of travel, a lot of time on my hands, often getting up on a morning and not really feeling like spending the next 8 hours talking to people. But one of the things I've found has always worked for me is to put a big smile on my face as I'm driving along. It lifts my mood. There's actually an experiment which has been replicated on lots of occasions, about putting a pencil in your mouth. It turns the edges of your mouth up and it sends a feedback loop into your brain telling you that you're feeling a bit happier than perhaps you might have been feeling a few minutes earlier. So a lot of this performative stuff and this faking it to make it can be a very powerful means. And I have to say, the very first time I was asked to talk to a group of people was just after I'd set up as a hypnotherapist. I was asked to go and talk to a local business club. And I prepared myself properly, and preparation is a huge part of this. Let's not forget that. You can't just go in and busk it, yeah? But I prepared my stuff, but then I spent the afternoon before that meeting basically curled up in the fetal position in bed, absolutely terrified. And what I managed to do that night was to pull some of this stuff out I've told you about, this idea of, all right, I'll go up and I'll be Bill, the hypnotherapist. I know me stuff. I've just got to get through this and show them that I'm confident about it. And that worked perfectly. And after a while, what can happen is this becomes a natural behavior that you adopt when you go into those situations where you might find it a little bit more intimidating.
Thank you for that, Bill. So for Victoria and Valerie, I'm going to come back over to you. In 2019, a Law Society poll found that 83% of newly qualified lawyers said they were currently experiencing or had in the past experienced imposter syndrome. Why do you think imposter syndrome is so prevalent among lawyers, especially newly practicing lawyers?
I'm happy to go for it first. Before I do so, I've noticed someone in the chat has just asked for a recap on what we mean by imposter syndrome. And the other two, no doubt, will add to the definition. But I think in general, the way I'd describe it is that experience of doubting your skills and talents and accomplishments, and having this persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. That's what I'd say is what we're talking about when we say imposter syndrome, for the person in the chat who just wanted a little reminder of what we mean by that. In terms of why we think it's so common and prevalent for newly practicing lawyers, there are two things really that for me are relevant. The first is that when you take the steps to practice as a lawyer, it is this absolutely ginormous learning curve. So you're starting out your training, and then you really leap up and step up, because you suddenly go to making decisions which are going to have a profound effect on someone's life. And it's a really big jump from learning about it in theory to having real life clients. And I think that is why imposter syndrome starts to kick in, because of that steep learning curve and that jump. The second factor is it's very well documented that people who end up being lawyers have got highly perfectionistic tendencies. Being a lawyer seems to be a career that attracts people who are real perfectionists. And if you're a perfectionist, I'd suggest that goes hand in hand with imposter syndrome in many cases. And so that's why I'd suggest that it's very common for lawyers. So that's my thoughts on it. I'm sure Valerie will want to add something her end.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think lots of lawyers suffer from this, particularly we've discovered women, but I think men suffer from it too. They just perhaps aren't as willing to disclose that. And I agree with Bill that trying to fake it till you make it is a good approach. And maybe I've poorly summarised your advice, Bill, but that's certainly an approach. I also think that the collaboration with colleagues is really, really important at the bar. So being able to speak to people about the difficulties that you're facing. I mean, I think we've all during this pandemic realised how important contact with our colleagues and friends and family is. And it's the same when you're working. If you have difficulties and you can chat them through, or you're doing your first court appearance as a pupil, and you can discuss what your submissions are going to be, that is great preparation. And that mentoring role that exists informally within chambers is one that I think we've probably all realised. We really find that we have missed it a lot, because quite often you might be chatting to somebody in chambers about an issue that they want to speak to you about, and when they finish you think, well, actually I might just get their view on my issue that I would like to talk about too. Or quite often you'll just be asking someone how they are, and they'll want to chat something through with you, and in and amongst just normal chatting, those issues get resolved. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that sharing with your colleagues and friends is a really good way to boost your confidence, because you use them as a practice session. And with that, you find that you can also bolster your confidence, because they'll support you and tell you what your strengths are, and give you ideas that perhaps you hadn't thought of. The other thing that I often think about and mention to pupils, and it's really something I've come across myself, is it's worth keeping like a little notebook, and in the back of the notebook you put all the things that you did wrong, as a sort of dumping, and you try not to look at the back of the notebook very often, but in the front of the notebook you write down all the things you do well. And the things that you do well, if you keep a note of them, and we're all so often not good at keeping in our mind's eye what we did well, we're always focused on what we did badly. If you keep a note of them, not only will you find that they will support you massively for when you have to make endless applications for all sorts of different lists as a criminal barrister that you have to be on over the years, but it's quite nice to sometimes look back at those. And I also say have the middle of the notebook for all the funny things that happen to you in court, of which there are many, certainly in my world. And I think, you know, that's a nice way to reflect sometimes. So yeah, I mean, those are sort of simple tips. I think one of the things about the wellbeing journey is a few of us have done various different trainings, and there are lots of good trainings out there. And if you're fortunate enough to come across something called the 3 principles, I don't know if any of you remember the children's film Inside Out, but trying to focus on the fact that a lot of it is in your mind, and having an understanding of what are thoughts and what are reality, I think has helped me a lot. So yeah, that would be my tips.
And Victoria, have you got any tips for struggling students who may be going through imposter syndrome?
Sure. I'm going to really strongly agree with Valerie that having a notebook or a list of things you do well is such a good idea, because it's so easy when you're feeling quite gloomy about the process to forget all the good things you've done. I keep a list of achievements on my phone, and then sometimes I'm really struck when I reread it of what's on there, which I've completely forgotten about. And it doesn't have to be all law related. It's just anything that you're slightly proud of, that you think, oh, that went well, put it on the list. And so I really do think that's a useful and positive tool. So I echo that. The other 2 things I'd say is, if you're a struggling lawyer, remember that when you're starting out, that's the time to mess up and make mistakes. It's okay. You're not expected to be perfect. You've only just started. So actually take that opportunity to just go for it. And then if you mess up, you mess up. And if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. If you speak to someone more senior, they can help you fix it. All of these things that seem like disasters at the time, they can be fixed. And even if you're a more senior barrister, that's why we have professional indemnity insurance if something goes absolutely horrifically wrong. So remember that. And the other, the second and final thing I'd say is that remember, it's a really good time when you start out to get out of your comfort zone and to learn new skills. And I think that the more you venture out of your comfort zone, the easier it becomes. And I truly believe the more you do that, it helps to quieten that negative voice that's telling you can't do it and you're no good. So those are my additional observations on that.
Thanks, Victoria. So now we're going to go on to building resilience. Employees with higher levels of resilience are said to feel and perform better at work, and they are 20% less likely to suffer from depression or be absent from work or have dips in productivity. So, Bill, from a psychological perspective, what drives someone to be resilient, and how can individuals get to the process of accepting and recovering from failure? Okay.
This definition of resilience is probably a good idea to get that in there before we even start. It's this idea of a person who's able to adapt well and quite quickly to change. And change is also always very scary for us as human beings. We like to have our certainties in there. So if you can develop some techniques or have some capacity to be able to do that, that's going to be to your advantage. And there's also this ability to bounce back quickly from stress. From my viewpoint, what we're looking at here is the idea of having a proper balance in terms of the ways in which, if we're doing this in the workplace environment, that work-life balance, so to speak. So it's about actually thinking about more than the job and the like. It's thinking about the whole, and it's about looking after yourself. There's a favorite Japanese proverb of mine, which is, you can't drink from an empty cup. Yeah, if you want to be useful to yourself and you want to be helpful to others, it's important that you look after yourself. It's not about being selfish, it's about having a healthy outlook around these things. And you know, as a good friend of mine once pointed out, you know, this is analogous to this idea that when you're on the, you remember when we used to go on planes and you used to sit there and you were getting the safety information at the very beginning. They used to talk about, you know, when the oxygen mask drops from the ceiling, pop yours on first before you try to help anybody else, because if you're not looking after yourself, how can you're not going to be in a position to help anybody else. So it's about this duty to look after yourself. So one of the most robust pieces of research around this, which was put together by the New Economics Foundation probably about 10 years ago now. A lot of the, under the Cameron government, we were looking at this kind of well-being agenda more and looking at sort of, rather than gross national product, looking at happiness and the like. They came up with a thing called the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, which was evidence-based ways in which we could look after ourselves and improve our mental health, improve our general well-being, and guess what? It has a knock-on effect to physical health as well. So they talked about the idea of connecting, and this is about that human connection. We are social creatures. We need to be there for each other. We're kind of herd animals, I suppose. And if you go back to positive psychology research, which was really at the forefront of stuff that was happening in the late 90s, what they found was that social support was one of the most important factors in terms of a person's well-being. Yeah, we do need each other. So that connection is about staying connected. And of course, there's been challenges during a time of COVID. Thank God we've got machines like this where we can at least get part way to that. It can be very important. So reaching out to people and maybe talking about your problems to them. Yeah, problem shared is a problem halved. That would be a very good way of opening that tap on that stress bucket and letting a whole lot of it out. Likewise, it can be very tempting, and it's been very tempting during the Zoom years here, to just sit on your backside and stare at a screen all day. Being active is important as well. If you look at the research base around depression, for instance, exercise has been found to be as effective as antidepressants for mild to moderate depression, sometimes a bit more so. And that's because on a fundamental level, what we do when we exercise is we produce endorphins, which are the body's good feel-good chemicals. We burn off the stress chemicals that go with the fight, flight, freeze reaction, as we're doing that in the way that nature intended. Yeah. There's lots of other whammies about socializing with people. If you're going down to a gym or going for a swim or going for a walk, and the things which come hand in hand with that. So, you know, if you're exercising regularly, maybe breaking a personal best, self-esteem comes up, or indeed, you know, as I say, you don't necessarily do this in isolation. You're more likely to meet people and get out of yourself, so to speak, in your own issues. Then the trendy version of this is to be mindful. I tend to keep away from that because people think automatically that means, oh, mindfulness, you want me to meditate. That's not for me. That's the whole tree hugging thing. Yeah. Well, actually, there's more to being mindful, to being in the moment than meditation. People do it in different ways. And so taking some time out to perhaps, and I know plenty of people who've done it during COVID, stand by the window and look outside and maybe look at the trees. I've got a couple of squirrels out there that give me delight every day with their antics. Yeah, that can give me that kind of respite to take myself out of the worries about what's happening, going to happen rather, and maybe mulling over the stuff that's perhaps been worrying me. I take that time to be in the moment. I've got a little bit of respite. Yeah, and what you're doing there really is you're putting the stress bucket down for a while. holding that stress bucket up can be, you know, quite a thing to be able to try to do. You know, it's quite difficult a lot of the time. If you take some time out to take notice, to be mindful, you can pop that down, and maybe you'll be in a better state to be able to pick it back up. You've got more resilience there. Learning is always important, continuing to learn. It doesn't have to be around the job, yeah, but if you maybe try to find something else that you can occupy your mind with that will help you learn new skills, and also, again, building up self-esteem and just taking an interest in the world. One of the most effective things I've seen up here in the Northeast with people who are experiencing depression was a self-help group that met at a big concert hall up here on the side of the Tyne called the Sage. They were meeting there every Saturday morning for months. And what they were all doing was learning how to play the squeeze box concertina, kind of one you see in the pirate films, you know. And it was fantastic because they were learning, yeah, but also guess what? They were getting all the benefits of teaching each other, mentoring. Maybe after a while, these were people who had been isolating themselves, who were saying, well, should we go for a coffee after this? Should we meet up in the week? Yeah, it was building those connections as well. So you can see if this was a Venn diagram, there'd be lots of crossover going on between these. And then the final one that they talk about is giving. And that's not necessarily giving to charity. It could be that you give some of your time, or you take some time out to phone a friend that you feel maybe not it might be helpful to, that they might find some support at this point helpful. On the other hand, I did meet a lady in Ireland a few weeks ago, said that she's got through COVID by looking at different charities every week and saying, I've got a little pot of money that I'm going to spend every week. I'm going to find the charity that I feel is going to benefit most from that at the moment. Yeah, and all of these things which can feed in to the whole of our kind of health, and taking ourselves and detaching ourselves from this for a little while so that we've got more resources available when we go back into that working environment. So it's ways to open that tap and drain some of that stress off so that you've got more capacity for stress when you get back into that environment. Okay.
Thanks, Bill. And what strategies would you recommend to students who are facing a lot of rejection, which in turn lowers self-esteem and motivation to pursue the work they're otherwise very passionate about?
Part of it would be the stuff that I've already talked about just there around that filling up that empty cup, draining the stress bucket, finding things that you can do for yourself in order to de-stress. Yeah, I would say talking to people about your issues can be a huge problem shared is a problem halved, as my grandmother used to say. I wish I'd listened more to her when I was a young lad now, because she did have an awful lot of wisdom. She'd been through one First World War, the Irish Civil War, and the Second World War. She managed to survive a lot of stress in her life. And also this acknowledgement that failure is almost inevitable. Yeah, and I think one of the ladies has already mentioned the fact that, you know, taking the time to realize that this is when you can experiment with things. A good friend of mine who ended up running a very successful business told me years and years ago now that in the first year of his business, he had lost a horrendous amount of money. He'd lost hundreds of thousands of pounds. But he said, you know, when I look at it now, I wouldn't change it for the world, because what I did in that period is I learned all of the things which I didn't need to do, all of the things which I made all my mistakes there, and I built on that. I learned from that. I was learning my trade. So it's this old idea, if you want to look it up, of failing forward, yeah, learning from failure and building from that, not beating yourself up about it, but saying, what can I do to make sure that, or to try to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And in coaching and in, say, mentoring around things like presentations in the past, one of the phrases I've used with people when doing the feedback session with them is something I've stolen from teaching. And you ask, it's WWWEBI. So ask yourself, what went well? Yeah. And as I think Victoria was saying earlier, so trying to grab those positives, which we do have a tendency as human beings to ignore, yeah? And that can get us trapped in a pattern of negative thinking. And then when we're being realistic about it, saying even better if, what can I do next time to improve my performance? And this should be really an iterative process that we keep revisiting right throughout our careers and right throughout our careers as human beings as well, so that we can move forward in a way which is good for both us and perhaps, you know, the people that we interact with as well, because we can also act as an example to others.
Thank you, Bill, for that. And staying on the topic of rejection, I'm going to come back over to Victoria and Valerie for this. It's a common part when applying for pupillage and maybe scholarships that you will get rejected, and you'll go through these feelings, which can sometimes be quite upsetting for students. But what words of wisdom can you give to aspiring barristers who feel they're stuck in that loop of receiving rejections from chambers and from INS and anyone that provides scholarships?
I would say, first and foremost, be kind and compassionate to yourself. It's a really hard thing to put yourself out there and apply for anything, and nobody likes to be rejected. So, you know, you've got to be kind to yourself. Obviously, the ultimate aim is to find that you're not rejected and that one chambers or even a whole host of chambers offer you a pupillage. But don't take it personally. I think that's really important. Know what your positive attributes are. And I know it's easy to say don't take it personally, because of course we all take rejection personally and all think, well, why didn't they want me? So I suppose on a practical level, I would say, look at what you've done, as Bill has said, in your application. See what other people who might know more than you think of it. So the INS very much offer support to pupils and have always done, and I think it's strengthened over the years. Use the INS, which also run mentoring programs, so that you can link in with somebody who hopefully might be able to give you good advice on what you've written or your answers to particular questions. Some chambers provide feedback, I know many don't. If feedback's an option, then that's always worth getting. But often feedback, despite everyone thinking that that might be the holy grail of answers, is often very generic and not necessarily what you need either. So I think it's about really sort of thinking to yourself, what could I do better? What can I improve on? And I think voluntary work does wonders to boost confidence. And I know that we've all got very busy lives and nobody wants to fit that in. But certainly speaking for myself, when I have suffered rejection over the years, I've often gone out looking for something that will fulfill me on that side of things. So voluntary work always I have found ever so fulfilling. And most volunteers find that they get back a lot more than they give. And I think it improves your confidence and your sense of self. And that's why I think a lot of people that do voluntary work do it forever, because they know ultimately that they get back far more than they give. So that's what I would say. Try and boost your confidence in any way you can. And you know, eventually you will be working, because anybody knows that anyone that works hard will always end up with a job. And it may not be the job that you first thought you were going to get, but it will be a job and you will build from there. And I'm afraid to say that the application process, certainly at the criminal bar, seems never ending. Even once you're in practice, you're regularly applying for things and you're regularly finding that you succeed on some don't succeed on other and have to reapply for things. And so it's worth, you know, accepting that that is part of who we are when we choose to enter the workplace, and working out when's the best time for you to do that in your day, and how do you best do that. So speaking for myself, if I've got applications that I need to do, I set time aside and I clear the diary, and I just rather grumpily put my head down and get on with it. And I don't like it. I don't think that's ever going to change, but I do it, and I know that I'm much better in the morning. So I try and get up early and I do stuff in the morning, and then I make sure the afternoon's something else. And I try and make it as easy on myself as possible. So I use a proofreader now to help with applications, so that I don't have to try and find all the spelling mistakes or things that don't make good sense. So that would be my advice.
Thanks, Valerie. I'll go over to Victoria.
Sure. Valerie's given a lot of really sound advice there. I'm going to pick out on some themes from that I particularly agree with. I think it's a really good idea as a student, if you don't have one already, to get a mentor from your inn, for example, because that gives you a person you can turn to who can support you while you're going through this process, who can give you honest advice and help. The inns aren't the only way of getting mentors. I've had a lot of mine approach me through LinkedIn or through Twitter. So don't be afraid if there's someone that you think, actually, I'd really like to have their support and have them in my corner. Do it and do approach them. One of the brilliant things about the bar is that we genuinely are a profession where we like to help people up, and we're collegiate. I think that's one of the best things about the bar. So do get yourself a mentor is the first thing. Sort of echoing what both Bill and Valerie have said about the whole, what can you do better? I think it's really important to consider what part of the process you're falling down at. So if you're not getting past the interview, or if you're not getting invited to interview, it would suggest to me that either there's a problem with the way you're presenting yourself on your form, or there's something in terms of a degree result or something like that that's quite a big deal that you need to handle and tackle somehow. Whereas if you're getting your rejections having gone for first interview, then maybe your focus needs to be working a bit more on your interview technique and so on. So I think try and finesse where it is in the process that which hurdle you're falling at, and then that can help you with concentrating your efforts a bit more. But I really would say give yourself huge credit for having gone through the process and made the application. I've been head of pupillage, and we got inundated with applications, and to the ones we rejected, we weren't saying you're no good. We're saying there are so many of you who've all done brilliant things. It just happens on this particular day, this candidate performed in a way that spoke to us more. So please don't feel really disheartened by that. So that's what I would say in terms of that loop of rejection.
Thanks, Victoria. And then when it comes to the time when students are applying for pupillage, they can become perhaps deflated, or they're juggling work and family life with the time for making those applications. I know myself, I decided not to apply for it this year because I had way too much going on. So what advice could you give to students who are in that position, who feel like they have to do it, they can't wait, or they can't wait till the following year, they feel like they're sort of being pushed to do it at that time?
Well, I remember someone pushing me, and I wanted to take 2 years off. I wanted to travel, and I knew that would probably be the only opportunity I'd have to take proper time off before starting a career. And I remember someone trying very hard to dissuade me. In fact, several people saying, 2 years. Anyway, it was the best thing I ever did. and I went with my gut, and I was right. And I think you have to do what you feel is right. And I don't think going into something where you're pressed and feeling really under pressure is a great way to go into it. I think you're much better off taking your time. I saw that there was a 5-year issue for pupillage when I was preparing for this talk, and I noticed that that is something that pupils often worry about, getting pupillage done within that 5 years. Is it after the exams are done? But I think 5 years is quite a long time, and I think the truth is, if you haven't done it in 5 years, then possibly you are going to be looking to do something else anyway, because 5 years down the line, you probably aren't going to want to become a pupil if you haven't achieved it or managed it by then. So I think, you know, just go with what you feel is right. And, you know, if it feels right to delay, I would not say that that should put you off. I think what you do with your time when you're delaying may be far more important and worthwhile to, you know, the actual application in the end. Sorry, Victoria, I think I might have cut.
Not at all. I entirely agree. I think I would say that if you, I sort of heard that question of it as if you're feeling quite overwhelmed by how do you even get down to it. And I think with actually doing the application, break it into bite-sized chunks. I mean, the way I would do it, for example, is, and believe me, we all hate those questions, why do you want to become a barrister, as much as the person answering them does. But rather than think, oh no, I've got to do my whole pupillage gateway form, think to yourself, this morning I'm going to get up half an hour earlier and I'm going to have a go at one question on the form. Don't make it, I'm going to do the whole form, but I'm going to do one question on the form. And for me, the reason I would get up earlier is because then I wouldn't have it hanging over me all day, and I'll just get it out of the way and get on with my day. And the other tip I will give, which I give to a lot of people whom I mentor, is that I find that when you're sitting with the form in front of you, you sort of go blank when you get this wretched questions in front of you. And you sort of, you're so concerned with typing your 200 words that it becomes a real arduous process. So what I actually say to my mentees is, get your phone, press voice record, ask yourself the question, and sort of treat it, put your phone to the side and treat it as though you were face to face with someone and they were asking you that question. Don't edit yourself, just sort of answer it freestyle and just say whatever comes in your head for as long as you want. When you finish, press stop, play it back, and then pause it and type out what you've got. And you'll actually find you've got quite an authentic answer, because you're not being too preoccupied with putting it on the page. You're just speaking as you would to a person in real life. And I find that is a really helpful way of getting something to put on your form. And then going back to what I said before about having a mentor, someone who can champion you and help you, then that's a great point at which you can say to someone, I'm really stuck. What answer do you think sounds better? And also, of course, avail yourself of the pupillage advice clinics. I mean, I'm Grays, and they run application form clinics where barristers will sit with you for half an hour and look at your form and give you some feedback and help on that. So that's what I would do to try and get down to it.
Thanks, Victoria. And I actually second that when it comes to having a mentor. I think it's really important to have a mentor that can tell you this advice, that can give you this advice. And to anyone here this evening, or maybe you're going to be watching the recording, LinkedIn is a fabulous place to reach out. It's not a mini pupillage that you're reaching out for, it is mentorship, and everything is completely different when it comes to that. So yeah, I really love that advice about mentorship. We've had a few questions come in, so hopefully we'll be able to get those answered. So there's one here. What advice do you have for aspiring barristers on financial anxiety and the overlap with burnout? And it leads on to, particularly in legal aid cases, so probably criminal more so, from a lower socio-economic background, to seek support to remain in the profession sustainably? And I suppose everyone could sort of answer that.
Well, the Inns certainly do financial support, different scholarships, and different chambers, I think, are obliged to advertise exactly how they support pupils. So I had, when I did pupillage, I remember my pupil supervisor thinking it was ridiculous, but I had a Saturday job, and it worked very well for me. I remember him saying, "Oh, that doesn't sound like a proper job for a barrister," but it kept the wolf away, and yeah, it worked. So I mean, I think, you know, it is financially challenging. It's less financially challenging than when we did it, where there was no financial support offered other than what you earned in your second sixth, or scholarships if you got a scholarship. Whereas now many chambers will support you through that first sixth. But I do understand it being an issue, because obviously now people come out of law school with huge debts, and I think that is just an added pressure. So I would say look to the Inns, look to what support is available. I remember looking for that, and I think there's much more of it now, 25 years on. So use it, because I think people often think, oh, I won't apply for that. It's not for me, but it is. It's pretty much for everyone that needs it.
I'd echo that, absolutely. There's a huge variety of scholarships. Once you're in your early days of practice, you have access to things like the Barristers Benevolent Association, which, for example, during COVID has created this hardship fund for people to avail themselves of. Something encouraging is that a lot of chambers do have schemes for the early years of practice, so that you don't jump straight into paying whatever rent you would as a tenant who's been there for some time. So, for example, in my chambers, you've got these really low rents for the early few years of your practice. So there's steps like that. And also, don't be afraid, if you are struggling financially, to have a word with someone, your mentor, your pupil supervisor, whoever, because there are things that can be done to give someone a bit of a breather financially if they need it. I mean, it's an absolute outrage. There's no two ways about it, what's happened to legal aid over the years. And I'm sure that Valerie and I could quite happily express our views on it for a very long time indeed. It's not right, what has happened with LASPO and legal aid or anything like that. But it doesn't, if you are someone who has the ability to be at the bar, there are ways of getting through the financial hardships of it, and you will have people around you who will be attuned to that and who can support you. And finally, I'd say on the Wellbeing at the Bar website, there is a section on financial concerns and financial worries, which I'd point you to just consider as well.
Thanks, Victoria. We've got a question here for Bill. What wellbeing initiatives do you think could be introduced in the workplace to further a more proactive rather than reactive wellbeing response?
Well, if we're looking at this sort of more joined up approach, I think one of the first things that should be addressed would be some training for a significant proportion of the people within a workplace around mental health awareness. That being because we don't talk an awful lot about this stuff. There's a lot of mystery around it. There's a lot of stuff that gets in the way of people talking about their mental health. If we can kind of normalize it by talking about what it is and what it isn't, yeah, that's going to be very helpful in terms of starting conversations within the workplace, and perhaps people being able to reach out for support when they might find it most helpful. The next, and it would be part and parcel of that, would be the idea of challenging stigma around mental health, which can actually be more toxic than for a lot of people than the mental health difficulties they might be experiencing themselves. Yeah, and there's a certain element of self-stigma in there when we've got attitudes around this. And within the workplace, making it sure that perhaps through poster campaigns or the like from Time to Change, I think is just stopping now, but there's a lot of materials that they have. Just getting stuff around the workplace to say this is the kind of culture in which we can talk about these things, and we've got progressive and constructive attitudes around this. We want to be able to be there for people who might need help if they're reaching out. And then when we're looking at that, perhaps surveying well-being within the workplace, perhaps on an anonymised base. There's a thing called the Warwick Edinburgh mental well-being scale, which is very widely used. I mentioned the Cameron efforts which were made during that particular government around it. It's the scale that was used, and it's been widely used right across the world for measuring well-being. And just get that kind of, on an anonymised basis, let's take a temperature of the workplace. Let's try and find out what's going on. Moving forward to perhaps organising things within the workplace which emphasise those aspects of the 5 ways to well-being that we were talking about earlier. Maybe arranging informal groups. I used to work in a big hospital on the outskirts of Dublin, and one of the initiatives that they had there for staff and for patients was a choir that met at lunchtime. And you cannot imagine how constructive it can be to have a good old bellow in the middle of the day, singing amongst another lot of people. That can be very helpful in building team spirit, in building community spirit, and letting stuff on the outside, walking campaigns, things like that, walking around the car park at lunchtime, setting challenges for people, saying who's going. There's a thing called a well-being bite, and these are things which you promote within the workplace, which can be anything that'll bring a smile to somebody's face. Yeah. So perhaps taking it in turns to bring something in at lunchtime, like a cake or something like that. Let's not get nothing too fattening, yeah? And then I think probably the most constructive thing that I've come across, which is based upon what they call wellness recovery action planning, is a personal wellbeing promotional plan. And if you are in that situation where we are looking at the those 6 management standards of the HSE, it's about, and there are pro forma kind of templates out there, in one-to-ones, talking to individuals about the kinds of things that they might find stressful in the workplace, the kinds of things which are maybe more protective factors for them, the kinds of things which might be most helpful to them in working to their full potential. So these can be around this idea of, the kind of reasonable adjustments that could be made to help a person work to, as I say, their full potential. And the research around these is that in terms of this, it's very rare for any of those adjustments to cost any more than about £75. And what you can be doing there is working on an individual basis, as I said earlier, that one size doesn't fit all around this stuff, and building that rapport around it. And also, maybe it's going to be easier for me to disclose to you some vulnerability that I might have once I know that I'm going to get that kind of support within the workplace. And what you find when you do this, when it's successful, is, productivity goes up, yeah, because it's not just about the fact that people aren't getting on well, but maybe you've got lower levels of presenteeism because people go and get help when they need it, yeah. The staff retention goes up, and also the evidence is that people are banging on your door wanting to come and work for you. So these things, when they do join up, it's a very human approach, and that's just kind of a handful of things off the top of my head which companies can use to build these healthier workplace cultures.
Thank you, Bill. There's a question here for Valerie and Victoria. Totally up to you if you want to answer it or who will answer it. How have you found managing your careers with your personal lives while setting boundaries between the two is important to have separation? It's quite easy for work to creep into your personal life. So how do you manage to keep the two separate?
I'll give this a go. It's really hard. You've got to work at it. It's not a thing that comes magically. You have to constantly make a conscious effort to do it. So by way of example, when I finish work for the day, I'm lucky enough to have a separate room in which I can work. I close my laptop, I leave that room, I don't go back in it until my next stint of work. I just physically step away from it. If you don't have a separate room in which you work, but you have a desk, shut your laptop, to do something, or have a ritual to close down your day. For example, recently I've been taking to, if I've been doing online hearings all day, I chuck my trainers on and I go out for a short walk, and that says to me that's the end of your working day. I think fresh air is hugely important, just getting a bit of fresh air rather than becoming inundated with work. And the other thing I think is have some cut-off points. Because it's really easy. You're not actually necessarily going to do a better job if you do 6 hours continuous on something. I think it's better to say, right, I'm going to work for the next hour, full pelt, then I'm going to stop and make a cup of tea, maybe come back to it then. And similarly, I always at the beginning of the day decide when my end to my day is, thinking, right, I'm going to stop work at whatever time it is, 6 p.m, 7 p.m. And so draw those lines and draw those boundaries. And try and integrate the things that make you feel good, because you're actually going to be a worse barrister if you're really resentful and you're just sitting hunched over your papers all the time. And do whatever works for you for relaxing. I mean, my personal way of relaxing is to binge watch box sets on Netflix. I mean, that might not be everyone's thing, but that works for me as a relaxation thing, just watching something challenging on Netflix. So look at those things that work for you, and don't assume you're going to be better if you just absolutely relentlessly work all the time and don't do anything you enjoy, because that's not the case.
Actually, it's funny you say that, Victoria, about this idea of the frequent breaks. The evidence base is there as well in brain studies, that the brain becomes habituated to something. When it becomes habituated to something, it feels that it's not important. It likes novelty. Yeah. So, for instance, the way in which we operate, I bet none of us can feel our clothes on our bodies at the moment, because it's not actually relevant to us until of course I mention it, then we can all feel them. Yeah. It's that kind of novelty of going back to something which makes the brain think, oh, this is something I need to concentrate on. Yeah. And when we're using the frontal lobes, actually it takes quite a lot of energy. So we need to take those breaks on a regular basis in order to get the most out of it.
I mean, I'd agree with Victoria. It's a real work in progress, and having good timetabling for yourself, and writing lists. That's my big one, where I cross things off and order things and what I want to do, and just really trying to make sure that you always have some time where you're not working. And you know when that is, and things to look forward to. So the sort of treats that are not all food related, that you know that when work finishes, these are the treats that you're going to have, and just trying to stick to that. But sometimes there is a creep, and then you have to kind of think about it and think how you want your life to look and readjust. And I think we do that all the time. I'm pretty good at not working on a Saturday. That's my best effort. Not sure it's good enough, but it's something that I try really hard to stick with. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I noticed somebody mentioned about not knowing what the assistance program is, and it's a counselling service that's confidential, that's on the Wellbeing at the Bar website. And if you actually type into the search of the Wellbeing at the Bar website, assistance program, it comes up as what is assistance program. There's frequently asked questions to download, and there's the telephone number for confidential help to call a counsellor, and you need only be a self-employed barrister or a member of the IBC or LPMA.
One of the things which sometimes gets in the way of people accessing EAPs is the idea that somehow they're reporting back to an employer.
Yeah, they're definitely not. We've covered that, Bill. We were absolutely sure that we didn't want any tracking of that by the Bar Council, to make sure it was all anonymous. We were really, really on that with a vengeance for that reason.
Great stuff.
And for Bill, I think this is the final question as well. You spoke of people, approaching you with concerns about disclosing their mental health to their employers in case of any negative impact. What would you say in particular to students and professionals early on in their careers in navigating this concern they may have?
All the research around health, full stop, talks about the how important early intervention is around all of these issues. So there may be things which are causing you concern, but particularly when we're talking about things like anxiety, avoidance can be one of the big traps that people fall into. Oh, if I don't do that, I can avoid feeling like that. So people might kick the can along the road because of different concerns, etc. All I can say to you is that if you are experiencing difficulties, it's important that you try to get help as quickly as possible, because the prospect for mental health issues, people can and do recover from mental health issues. The majority of do, yeah. But you can't do this stuff necessarily on your own. You're probably going to need some support from professionals and some people who perhaps can support you in the most effective way for you. So accessing help, perhaps through the EAP, as soon as you've got any concerns about yourself, or maybe somebody else raises a concern that you're not as you would ordinarily be, yeah? Are you okay? Kind of thing. This is not how you would ordinarily behave. Maybe taking some time out and saying, do I need to go and reach out for some help? Because it's, as they say, you know, that cliche, it's okay not to be okay. Yeah, we all need some help on occasion.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to all of the guest speakers this evening, Victoria, Valerie and Bill. But unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So yeah, thank you so much. I've learned so much this evening. I've been jotting down all the advice as we've been going along as well. And I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the attendees when I say it's been a great evening and a great insight into what's available for students. And of course, for anyone, if you do feel that you need support, there are all the organisations and initiatives that have been mentioned here this evening, and I'm sure universities do provide some support as well, like Young Minds and Together All. So thank you once again, everyone, for being here, and I'd like to give a special thanks to Red Lion Chambers for providing the platform this evening for this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.